Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this series, we examine some of the foundational concepts in political economy. In this video, we're going to look at the basic economic concepts of supply and demand. In traditional economics, we normally think of markets as being comprised of buyers and sellers. Buyers as a group determine the demand for an item, and sellers as a group determine the supply. Traditional models of supply and demand make a number of assumptions about how the market works. And while we don't need to get into all of them, we should note that these assumptions about the market include the idea of perfect competition, as well as the idea that no actor in the market can individually determine or influence by themselves the market price. That is to say, everyone in the market is a price taker, either forced to buy or sell at whatever price is determined by the market. So if neither buyers nor sellers can dictate the price of goods in the market, how are prices and quantities determined? By the laws of supply and demand. In the simplest term, the law of demand states that as the price of a good increases, the quantity of that good demanded decreases. The corollary holds true as well. As the price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. A similar law of supply holds that as the price of a good increases, the quantity of that good supplied increases as well. And the corollary here holds true as well. As the price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases as well. Now, normally we see these represented graphically with the prices listed on the vertical axis and with prices moving up as we increase along the axis, and the quantities demanded listed along the horizontal axis with quantities increasing as we move from left to right along the axis. The demand curve shows how much of a given good we demanded at each price level along the line. In other words, each point on the line in the graph shows how many units of a particular good would be demanded at a particular price. A couple of items are particularly worth noting here. First, notice that the demand curve slopes downward. This is because normally people will purchase less of a particular good as the price gets higher and more of a particular good as the price gets lower. Again, this is a reflection of the law of demand, where price and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. There are several reasons why demand declines as price increases. The first is the principle of diminishing marginal utility, which says that in general, our additional satisfaction tends to decline as we consume more and more of a particular good. Think about your satisfaction from eating your first ice cream cone in a sitting and contrast that with how you would feel after 3 ice cream cones or 10 ice cream cones or so on. The marginal happiness or utility you get from consuming an item tends to decline the more of that item you consume. Demand curves also shift as a result of a number of other factors, which we sometimes describe using the acronym BITER. The number of buyers in a market, that is, the more buyers means that there is generally more demand for a product, increasing its price. Income, changes in consumer income can increase or decrease demand for product. Tastes, changes in preferences or the popularity of a product can increase or decrease demand for that product. Expectations, consumer expectations about what might happen in the future can lead them to change consumption patterns in the present. And related goods, the availability of complements or substitutes can affect demand for a particular good. Changes in demand can occur in a couple of different ways. First, price changes may drive changes in demand. When price drives changes in the quantity of a good demanded, it's reflected in a shift along this demand curve. That is to say, at a price of P1 per widget, the quantity demanded is Q1 widgets. But if the price of widgets increased from P1 to P2, the quantity of widgets demanded would decrease from Q1 to Q2. This is reflective of the law of demand. Second, when demand for an item increases at all price levels, the entire demand curve may shift to the right, meaning that there is more demand for a good at all price levels. And the opposite of this is also true. The entire demand curve may shift to the left if the quantity of an item demanded at all price levels decreases. Shifts in the entire demand curve in this way are usually a reflection of the BITER variables we discussed earlier. Supply functions in a similar way as demand, although responding in an opposite manner due to the law of supply. At any given price, a certain number of goods will be supplied, and as that price increases, more of that good will be supplied. A couple of items are worth noting. First, the supply curve slopes upward. This is because normally producers will supply more of a particular good as the price gets higher and less of a particular good as the price gets lower. Again, this is a reflection of the law of supply, where price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. The upward slope of the demand curve is driven by several factors. First, the nature of costs and profit. As producers expand output in response to higher prices, they must purchase additional resources to use in the production process, both in terms of labor and raw materials. This generates additional costs, but the higher prices can also generate additional profit, incentivizing producers to expand production. Supply curves can also shift as a result of a number of other factors, which we sometimes describe using the acronym STONER. Subsidies and taxes by government can encourage or discourage the production of particular goods. Improvements in technology can change productivity levels, increasing supply. Decisions by businesses to produce other goods can shift resources between industries in response to price signals, leading to changes in the level of supply. The number of sellers in the market can affect production output levels and thus supply. Expectation about future prices and economic conditions can influence decisions around output and production levels. And finally, resource costs will also influence business decisions and thus production levels. In a similar but inverse way as changes in demand, changes in supply can occur in two ways. First, price changes may drive changes in supply. When price drives changes in the quantity of goods supplied, it's reflected in a shift along the same supply curve. That is to say, at a price of P1 per widget, the quantity supplied is Q1 widgets, but if the price increases from P1 to P2, the quantity of widgets supplied would decrease from Q1 to Q2. This is reflective of the law of supply. Second, when the amount of an item supplied increases at all price levels, the entire supply curve may shift to the right, meaning more of an item is supplied at all price levels. Conversely, the entire supply curve may also shift to the left in the quantity of an item supplied at all price levels decreases. Shifts in the entire supply curve are usually reflective of the Stoner variables we considered earlier. And when we bring the supply and demand curves together in a single graph, it becomes fairly easy to see the point at which supply and demand meet, telling us the price and quantity of the good demanded. This is usually referred to as the market equilibrium at a particular moment, the point where supply and demand curves cross. This point is sometimes also called the market clearing price, as it reflects the fact that the quantity of the goods supplied matches the total demand for the product at any given price. Generally, markets tend to favor the market equilibrium point. But what happens when the supply of and the demand for a good don't match? There are two situations which are particularly worthy of consideration. First, consider a situation in which the amount of a good supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. Let's say the price of a good is currently at this point, P2. This is a price level well above the price equilibrium point, which is denoted as P1 here. The difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at the current price level reflects an excess supply. In economic terms, a surplus. A surplus generally signals that the current market price for a good is too high, and that at that price level, consumers will not purchase all of the product that suppliers are willing to provide. In a competitive market, surpluses are unstable, and we generally expect producers to lower their price in order to sell the goods and clear the market. Alternatively, consider a situation in which the amount of a good supplied is well below the quantity demanded. Let's say that the price of a current good is currently, at this point, P3, the price well below the market equilibrium point denoted as P1 here. The difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at the current price level reflects a shortage in economic terms. A shortage generally signals that the current market price is too low, and that at that price level, total demand by consumers will not be met. In competitive markets, shortages, like surpluses, are unstable, and we generally expect producers to either raise their price or to increase production, or both. Knowing all this, it's easy to understand why economists, particularly classical and neoclassical economists, are generally suspicious of many forms of market interventions by the state. For them, any effort to affect supply and demand can lead to undesirable and often unintended consequences. Indeed, economists often label this the law of unintended consequences. Economists argue that the unintended consequences can have perverse outcomes that can undermine the goal of the policy in the first place. Let's briefly consider two examples. First, take price ceilings. Price ceilings are efforts to impose a maximum permissible price for a good through regulation. But if the price ceilings imposed here, reflected as P2, is below the market clearing price of P1, such policies will often lead to shortages, as the quantity demanded at the lower price will exceed the quantity supplied at that price. This is sometimes used as a criticism of rent control policies, the idea that rent controls will lead to reduction in quantity of housing supplied in the market. Or consider the opposite case, that of a price floor, a minimum allowable price for a good. These are less often the result of government intervention and more often reflective of producer cartels which seek to impose higher prices by reducing the quantity of goods supplied to the market. In this case, reflected in the price level P2, the quantity supplied at that price exceeds the quantity demanded at that price, leading to an oversupply of that good, a surplus in economic terms. This argument is sometimes used to argue against increasing the minimum wage, essentially that imposing a higher floor on the price of work, a minimum wage, will lead to an oversupply or surplus of workers, in other words, the higher rates of unemployment. The final element of supply and demand we'll cover here is referred to as elasticity of supply and demand. Put simply, elasticity refers to how much supply or demand change in response to changes in prices. The relative elasticity of demand, that is, the degree to which demand is relatively elastic or inelastic, addresses how much demand will change relative to changes in the price of a good. If demand for a good is relatively elastic, small changes in price will lead to larger changes in demand. Conversely, if demand is relatively inelastic, the quantity of a good demanded will not change very much even as price changes. The elasticity of demand is affected by a number of factors, including the availability of close substitutes. Goods for which there are readily available close substitutes will tend to have more elastic demand than goods for which there is no easy or close substitute. Elasticity is also influenced by whether the good is considered a luxury item or a necessity. Goods that are necessities will have more inelastic demand, as they are by definition necessities. Goods which are considered luxury consumptions, by contrast, will have more elastic demand. The time horizon can also affect elasticity, as longer time horizons generally permit consumers to find alternative products, thereby reducing the elasticity of demand. Graphically, what does price elasticity of demand look like? It's reflected in the slope of the demand curve. More inelastic demand is reflected in a demand curve that is more vertical in its orientation, again reflecting the fact that changes in supply and therefore price have relatively little impact on demand. At the most extreme level, perfectly inelastic demand would be represented by a vertical demand curve, and that would mean that demand would remain constant regardless of changes in price, though this situation would be quite uncommon. Instead, we'd expect to see some goods with this kind of relatively inelastic demand. But what are examples of goods with relatively inelastic demand? Gasoline seems like a good example to me. In much of the United States, there are no ready or easily available alternatives to driving your car, which requires gas regardless of the price. Other examples might include prescription drugs and medical care or other basic necessities of life. Indeed, the relative price inelasticity of demand for prescription drugs and life-saving healthcare is one reason commonly given in support of a universal model of healthcare provision. Conversely, relatively inelastic demand curves were reflected in a flatter, more horizontal line, and will be much more sensitive to changes in price than a relatively inelastic curve will be. Here, small changes in price will lead to much larger changes in the quantity of a good demanded. Items that have relatively high elasticity of demand include things like airline tickets, because of the very competitive nature of the market and the readily available alternatives for most travel, or soft drinks, again because they're generally considered non-essential items characterized by a high level of substitutability and market competition. If the relative elasticity of demand reflects how much demand for a good changes relative to changes in price, the elasticity of supply operates similarly with respect to the supply of a good. The more elastic the supply, the more dramatically small changes in price will affect the quantities supplied. Conversely, the more inelastic a supply curve, the less sensitive it will be to changes in price. Like elasticity of demand, the elasticity of supply can be affected by a number of factors, including the number of producers and the relative ease of entering the market or of switching production of goods. Goods for which it is relatively easy to increase supply will tend to have more elastic supply curves compared to goods where there are more barriers to entry or of production. The length of the production process can also affect the elasticity, with goods taking longer to produce having relatively more inelastic supply curves. Think of the difference between producing, say, a 25-year-old bottle of scotch versus a new bottle of beer, for example. Graphically, what does price elasticity of supply look like? Again, it's reflected in the slope of the supply curve. More inelastic supply is reflected in a more vertical supply curve, reflecting the fact that the quantity of the good produced or supplied will not change very much even as the price of that good changes. Examples of goods with relatively inelastic supply curves might include a variety of goods that take a long period of time to produce, from housing to the 25-year-old bottle of scotch we mentioned previously. We'll use many of these concepts throughout the course. Elasticity of supply and demand, for example, can help us understand the failure of structural adjustment programs in the Global South, and the law of unintended consequences can help explain a failure of a number of government programs. The laws of supply and demand will help us explain trade policy and the challenges posed by different forms of market intervention. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.